The agenda this week turned its attention to Olympic host country Russia, examining the controversy over its anti-gay legislation, its burgeoning relationship with China, and its modern cultural identity. But the agenda's week in review begins here in Canada, the hockey nation. I want to kick things off playing a collage of ads that we've seen on the air in recent months. Take a look at this.
Winter gives us everything and expects us to give it all back. We are Canada. We are winter.
Jonathan Toews' goal, assisted by the early rising parents, the backyard rink builders, the tireless fundraisers, the coaches and trainers, the pre-game meal makers, the kindly business sponsors, and everyone else whose efforts prove there's no such thing as an unassisted goal. We all play for Canada.
All right, those are just a few of the ads we're seeing on our television or have been in the past few months. There are numbers of them. These are just a couple we put together. Shima, let me begin with you. I want to ask each one of you, what was your first impression, not after you had some time to think about, first impression when you see an ad like that?
Well, I liked all of them. I felt proud. I felt connected. And I really liked the ads.
Parminder, how'd you feel?
I mean, I'd have to agree with Shima. I think with me, the Canadian Tire ad was the first one that I saw. I was like, you know what, this is actually cool, because put things into perspective, that there's more that goes into a hockey player than what we kind of see. And so I kind of liked that. I thought it was kind of an introspect into what hockey player and junior hockey is all about.
David?
For me, I'm an American. I've been living in Toronto for about 8 years now, so I think it's a reflection into Canadian culture. I didn't realize how much hockey was a rite of passage till 4 years ago during the Olympics. And that's, I think, so the ads really kind of helped me understand a bit more about what it means to be Canadian and how that gets broadcast back to us.
Bruce, I'm going to ask you about your personal reflections. You're a branding expert, and we'll talk to you about that coming in from that perspective. But personally, when you see an ad like that, what's sort of your first gut impression?
Really very much like those of your other guests. I thought they were terrific. I indulged myself in associating with those feelings and kind of being proud and the rare permission we get in Canada to be patriotic without seeming jingoistic about it.
So you felt patriotic watching those?
Kind of small p patriotic.
Small p, not big P.
Not big
no
P.
big P's.
No.
Okay, Omer?
I would agree with the other guests. I mean, I really felt patriotic, proud, I guess, of the ads. I think the winter one was really interesting because everyone knows Canada is really cold and it gets a lot of snow, and this was sort of, let's reclaim winter, let's make it, a part of our identity, and let's be proud about it. The hockey one was really interesting as well. I like the aspect of community, but I found that it was a little too, and here it comes, white, I found. I found that, as someone, I don't play hockey, I do watch it. I'm not watching the Olympics, as we talked about earlier, but I found that, there weren't as many visible minorities in that ad as I would have liked to have seen. But other than that, I like the aspect of community, of everyone coming together.
I want to get back to something that Omer just said, that he said he didn't see himself in this commercial. I'm not a white guy, and it's not any shock to anyone here that three of the panelists tonight and the host are not white people. So Shima, when you said, it made you felt proud to watch those commercials, and yet you didn't see anyone who looks like you at all in those commercials. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, first, I don't know, maybe I'm colorblind, but I just saw Canadianness in all of these ads. The winter one, I mean, I grew up in Quebec, and Gilles Vigneault had that famous anthem, Mon pays, c'est pas mon pays, c'est l'hiver. So in Quebec, we've known that feeling for decades. And the Canadian Tire ad, I believe Mr. Toews grew up out west, and his story, I think, is a reflection of the community that he grew up in. If you were to do the same ad, let's say in 4 years with P.K. Subban, I would expect to see perhaps a different makeup. but I think that ad just reflects the reality of small communities, across the country. It's in the big metropolitan centers that you'll see more people of color.
Parminder, let me ask you. You were I believe, the first Canadian commentator of Hockey Night in Canada, Punjabi. Is that right? Okay.
That's right.
So you're a guy who's interested in hockey. Did you play hockey?
No, I did, but I didn't play organized hockey.
Okay.
Yeah.
You don't see yourself in those commercials either.
I don't, and I mean I've been to the community rinks. I've in Toronto I have, and I see the people that I grew up with playing shinny hockey, going skating, and I grew up in a very mixed racial community. From the Jane and Finch area, I was skating with Jamaicans. My friends were Vietnamese and Korean, and those are the kind of individuals that I saw. Now, and I agree with Shima that if Canadian Tire was trying to do a reflective on Jonathan Toews, then I understand where they're coming from. But if they're trying to grow the sport and if they're trying to increase sales, as a company would, then I think they could have done a better job with the ad, because it doesn't make me feel, or that say my kids, that I'd want them to play hockey. There isn't anybody they could relate to in that ad. But as a hockey commentator, as a person who's played hockey and been to these arenas, yeah, I can totally relate. I see the volunteers there. I see the local community getting involved in the businesses. So in that sense, I liked the commercial. I actually felt really good about it, that, hockey is more than what you kind of see with that single player. But is it reflective? If that's what Canadian Tire was going for, then probably not.
Okay, Bruce, put on your professional hat, because Parminder just, talked about maybe the ideas that they're trying to grow sales, and if they are, then they should include, a more diverse representation of Canadian. Right. Put on your branding hat. I mean, what are they trying to do in this ad, in these kinds of ads?
Well, I think they're trying to evoke the feelings that we all described at the beginning of this. Yeah,
they got us.
And exactly, they have. I feel strongly that marketers have no moral duty to ram ideology down our throats, but they do have a moral duty to reflect the society they're trying to sell to. So my inclination would be to look again carefully at that advertising and see whether, in fact, that reflection is happening. We all just let it wash over us and reacted. Marketers tend not to do things that don't work for long, so we have to conclude that there's more right than wrong going on in that stuff, and evaluate it accordingly.
The point was made though, that maybe this is appealing to more white Canada, not in the big urban centers like Toronto, Montreal. But I mean, we can keep going. Calgary, Vancouver, Edmonton, Halifax. I mean, these aren't major centers, all of them, but they are at least growing in their diversity. And again, from a branding perspective, would you take that into consideration, or is it that traditionally it's been a white sport, or snow sports are considered white, if I can call it?
I'd be shocked if anyone sat around a boardroom table during the creation of those ads and says, we got to make sure we have a lot of white people. If the society that we live in wasn't accurately reflected in those ads, that was probably no more than negligence. But again, I'm not sure that that's the case.
So not deliberate.
Yeah.
You're not deliberately excluding
I don't
anyone.
think so, and maybe that's not to our credit either. I mean, working with clients in the United States, it's quite common to have a client say that the cast of the commercial must reflect the society in terms of ethnicity and gender. That's a common, explicit requirement. You don't see that as often in Canada. So we may just take it all for granted, and that produces the occasional misstep.
These sports are expensive, so they reflect not only just a particular racial group, but also particular ability to spend on a recreational activity, right? So this call for us to play hockey is really only heard by a small portion of that population, and with the correlation between wealth and race in North America, it's not that surprising that white people are the predominant players of hockey throughout Canada.
We are going to talk specifically about hockey in just a minute, but Omer, you want to hop in here.
Yes, well, I just want to say I wasn't offended by the ads. That's not the feeling that I had, but I think that, look, as a reflection of hockey, it's perfectly reflective. You can put on an NHL game and you see that most of the people are white. But I think if you're going to wrap yourself around the flag, then I think you have a duty. I wouldn't call it a moral duty, but I think you do have some sort of duty to be reflective of the ethnocultural diversity of this country, where, in the next 5 years, 1/5 of the country is going to be, visible ethnic minorities. And, when you're putting this sort of image of the country out there for the world to see, I think that you should be reflecting the diversity of the country in its totality.
Because I guess the argument is, these commercials are not selling hockey. They're trying to get us to join the Olympic spirit, to feel our nationality. They're not trying to get us to fill seats at the Air Canada centres. So by just focusing, on that sort of white demographic, are they missing something here, Bruce?
Well, I think so because inclusiveness is discussed in this kind of context as being inherently an ethical imperative, and we sort of stop there. We don't tend to think enough about what inclusiveness might mean. We don't tend to think enough about how someone of color successfully playing professional hockey is a story about overcoming adversity, and that's inherently Canadian, or some other kind of heroism that attaches to those things. I think that we don't show enough imagination about that stuff sometimes, but we have to bear in mind, marketing does tend to play to the lowest common denominator because that's where everybody is, that's where the money is. And when Statistics Canada asked us in the last census to identify our ethnic origins, fully a third of Canadians essentially declined to answer the question and said Canadian. Mm-hmm. So that says to me that on some level, we'd rather not focus on what makes us different.
Take a listen to this. This is Putin last month talking about the anti-LGBT laws.
We aren't banning anything. We aren't rounding up anyone. We have no criminal punishment for such relations, unlike many other countries. So one can feel relaxed and at ease. But please, leave the children in peace. We have our own traditions and culture. We respect all our partners. We just ask to respect our traditions and culture.
Matthew Rajansky, is this anti-homosexual attitude part of Russia's, as the president puts it, part of Russia's tradition and cultures?
Right. I mean, I think he's making a case that he believes is going to sit well with the majority of Russians, and more than that, with the majority of his supporters. In particular, he doesn't expect support from urban liberal intellectuals. He does not expect support from, pro-Western internationalist folks. He expects support from a conservative, quite religious, traditional, often rural constituency in Russia, and this does play very well with them. But it's very important to note the second piece of that, which is the international dimension. Again, it's pointing out a kind of foreign boogeyman. Oftentimes it was ethnic groups, Jews, for example. Now it's gays and lesbians. The idea that they're part of an international conspiracy, some kind of international effort to delegitimize Russia, to assault Russia, that's actually a useful device, and it allows the Kremlin then to portray these Olympic Games as Russia standing up against all odds, Russia doing the right thing, Russia standing up for Russian values against this unfair international scrutiny.
Helen, let me ask you about what Matthew just said there. He says, this is similar to discriminating against different races, different groups of people. You're a gay woman. When you hear that a country that the world is now focused on, we have sent our athletes to, politicians have gone, how does that make you feel?
Well, I mean, I think it's, when you look at why it's been done the way it's been done, it's rather appalling, because he's using political opportunism to seek out the most marginalized in society, in many societies around the world. So it's to advance his own political cause. It doesn't necessarily mean that the Russian population in general would support those particular views. But you're looking at the most marginalized, vulnerable people in our society. And it's a direct attack on those people for political gain, right? So you can't justify that. There is no justification for the violence that is occurring right now in Russia against the LGBT community. Gay bars have been closed, film festivals have been attacked, youth are being assaulted and publicly displayed on the internet. And, we didn't bring homophobia, or we didn't bring homosexuality to Russia. It's always been there. And this is something that I think that people need to understand. It's not a Western value per se. It's something that's intrinsic within their own society. It's in every society.
Mark Bennett joins us now from Moscow via Skype. He's the author of the book, Kicking the Kremlin. Hello.
Hello. Good evening.
Okay, let's start by talking about the man at the center of Russia, Vladimir Putin, of course, longest-serving leader of Russia since Stalin began his third term as president, 2012, served before that a short term as PM, and now he could stay in power until 2024. Mark, I want to go back to the beginning of Putin as the leader of Russia back in 2000. How would you characterize Russia at the time?
Putin inherited Russia from Boris Yeltsin, who was the first post-Soviet leader. And Russia at the time was in a terrible way, politically, economically, socially. And Putin basically came in and cleaned up a lot of things. So for his first term, everyone was very, very pleased with him.
And when he comes into power, so we're about 10 years after, the official end of the Cold War, what's his goal? It's a guy who was a mayor at one time. He comes in, he now rules a very vast country. What's his objective when he takes over as president?
I think his objective was to restore a sense of stability to Russia. I mean, he said Russians have had no stability for the last 10 years. We need to give them this feeling again. And to his credit, he did it. I mean, when he took over, salaries weren't being paid, crime was rampant. There were lots and lots of problems. But Putin.
So he's sort of seen as a savior.
Yeah, he was certainly a savior for his first term. Yeah.
All right, I want to read something from your book about something you call Putinism. So you've written this, but take a listen to it. You write, Putinism, this strange new hybrid of Soviet-type authoritarianism and free market morals, was based on the concept of sovereign democracy. The malleable term drew heavily on the works of one of Putin's favorite philosophers, Ivan Ilyin, an intellectual exiled by Lenin, who believed that Western-style democracy was not only unsuitable for Russia, but also harmful. Russia, Ilyin believed, required a united and strong state power, dictatorial in the scope of its powers. Sovereign democracy, right, essentially meant that the state should exert robust controls over a nominally democratic political system, one that was free of any foreign influences whatsoever. The political playing field was open to both the left and the right and everything in between, but the number one rule, inflexible for participation, was the Kremlin is always right. Okay, Mark Bennett, I mean, some people believe that a country as vast as Russia, as big, as diverse as Russia, can only exist with an authoritarian leader, either a czar or a dictator. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, history would seem to indicate that that's correct, that Russia does need authoritarianism. Of course, not everyone agrees with that. And when the protests started in 2011, and even before this, a growing number of the so-called middle class, so-called creative class in Russia began to think that maybe they'd perhaps like a little softer, less authoritarian type of leader.
And do you think they're right? I mean, do you think this is a country that needs, quote unquote, needs a strong man, or could it have, a different structure?
Well, obviously it could have a different structure. It would take a long time to develop, though. I mean, even the opposition movement is based basically around the concept of a savior, Alexei Navalny, who's basically the opposition's de facto movement. A lot of the criticism coming to him is that his followers see him as like the savior of Russia rather than just a politician. So there's a very deep need in the Russian psyche maybe for a savior figure. And then, of course, they get the savior, and then they get disappointed in the savior, and they look for another one. So it's been going on for centuries.
I want to look a little bit about how these two countries are connected economically, because you referred to that in a general sense, but let's break this down. Okay, in Russia, 2012, GDP grows by 3.5%. Comparatively, China's grows by 7.8% in 2012. It's come down since then. Russia is selling to China things like military, space technology, energy, oil, blah, blah, blah. China is selling to Russia what it sells to the rest of the world, and that's consumer goods.
Right.
Last 20 years, bilateral exchange between these two countries has been multiplied by 14. The countries, Russia and China, have a target of 77.5 billion euros of bilateral trade by 2015. Okay, 77.5 billion euros bilateral trade by 2015. Gordon Chang, how much do these countries, how dependent are they on each other economically?
Well, I think China is still much more dependent on the United States, for instance. Last year, about 122% of China's overall trade surplus related to sales to the U.S. That's incredible. So China's surplus against the U.S. was much bigger than its overall surplus. So this really shows a dependence on the United States. And of course, its dependence on Western Europe is also big. But nonetheless, you see a lot of growth in the China-Russia trade relationship. And what's important is many people are starting to think that the Russians are going to start selling the crown jewels of their military, of their arsenal. They haven't done that before. They've sort of sold second-line equipment. But now many people are starting to think that because this tie-up is really becoming cemented, that the Russians are going to start selling really top-of-the-line fighters and submarines. This is going to be a problem for us.
Well, they might need them, both countries, because they both got territorial disputes. China with Japan over that set of islands, Russia disputing with its former Soviet countries. So the strained relations, each of them has them with their immediate neighbors. How does that play into these two big super behemoths coming together?
Well, it was very interesting that at the end of last year, Xi Jinping invited the Russians to help the Chinese guarantee peace and security in East Asia. Now, a lot of other countries would not think that that's a good development because, China not only has territorial disputes with Japan, it has territorial disputes with India, the 6 or 7 nations on the South China Sea, and with South Korea. So you have this arc of instability with India in the south to South Korea in the north. China is trying to grab territory, sometimes using forceful tactics. Now, I don't think the Russians really want to become a part of that, but Xi Jinping might sort of drag them in. And this would not be good if we have to face not just China, which would be bad enough, but also China and Russia. Because this is an axis, an axis of gigantic states. Who knows? But it's going to be really tough for us.
And of course, Russia currently, its dispute with Ukraine right now, also trying to say, hey, I'm the big guy here. You'll stay under my thumb. So both of them fighting on that front. But you talked about the military spending. So both these countries, again, putting lots and lots of their own money into the development of their own militaries and growing for the first time in 5 years. On the other side of the world, in the West, we have countries, the United States namely, where we're, time of austerity, drawing down on military spending. So what's going on here? There's these two countries over there, if I can put it that way, spending lots. We're not spending as much. We're drawing down. They're outfitting their army so rapidly. Why? So rapidly, why?
Well, I think part of the reason why in China is because the Chinese military has become very, very powerful within the political system. You have a political system which is probably in distress. You have Xi Jinping trying to consolidate his position. He needs the flag officers because the People's Liberation Army is the most powerful faction inside the Communist Party. And Xi Jinping is not in a position to tell the generals and admirals no. So when it comes to spending, those guys are going to get a lot of the budget. And that's going to continue. They say that they're going to spend $148 billion. No, they're going to spend, somewhere upwards of $300 billion in all probability. There's a lot we don't know about Chinese military spending, but it is big. It's growing fast. It's probably growing faster than the economy, which is the important thing. And the question is, how long can this continue? But in the interim, though, the flag officers are really very politically potent, and that's why they get to have a big say in China's foreign policies.
I've been a hip-hop fan since I was about 11 years old, and I've been a rapper, either aspiring or professional, since 19. And when I was given this challenge of writing evolution-themed raps, the challenge came from a biologist. That's how it kicked off.
This is how this all started. You didn't say one day, you didn't wake up and say, hey, it'd be really cool if I rapped about Darwin.
No, I think if I had woke up and had that thought, I would have pushed it aside as too improbable and not pursued it. But in this case, I had a friend who was a scientist, and he had met me while I was doing a tour in England of my previous show, which was about the Canterbury Tales. That's the other thing I used to rap. And he challenged me, his name is Mark Palin, and he challenged me to write rap songs about Darwin for a conference that he was organizing. And he gave me a 6-month lead time. And he said, if you can write these in time for my conference, I'm going to buy you a plane ticket, pay you a fee, and you will be the entertainment at my conference.
Okay, rapping the Canterbury Tales, although unusual. I mean, you have a link to it. You have a degree in comparative literature. You're an English major. Science, not your thing, right? I mean, in terms of what you studied and stuff. So when you rap about science, how do you make sure you get it right, that you get the facts right?
Well, this was something I was very intimidated by at first. But Mark, the person who commissioned the work, helped me out with that. He said, you're going to be performing for all of my science colleagues, which means you're in the position to embarrass me if you don't get the science right. So you have to send me the lyrics in advance so I can fact check them for scientific accuracy.
So essentially you were peer reviewed.
I was peer reviewed. But at first I was intimidated by that, but I thought, okay, I'm just going to read my way through the source material and then try to capture the essence of it. And there's something about being peer reviewed that has a lot of swagger in it. Because I can stand on stage now and be like, what? I represent science, like me, you take it up with my sources. And the sources are working biologists and the leading thinkers in evolution.
I gotta say, when I heard that you were rapping about science, I hadn't seen your work before. I was like, this is going to be super nerdy or dorky. It's not. It's cool stuff. I mean, if you didn't listen very closely, you didn't know it was about science. It sounds like most rap does. It's good and it's catchy. But I'm curious, given that it is about science, who's listening to this stuff?
Well, I think there's a there's a niche of rap fans that want something more from their content. At least that's what I started with, is that hope or that sense. And personally, that's just how I feel. I am entertained by being intellectually stimulated. And the people who inspire me to do that are rap artists who have high levels of intellectual content, also comedians who talk about politics and religion and science in their work. And I just wanted to try to be that for hip hop. So who is my audience? It's all over the place. But 20s and 30s, young professionals. Check it out a lot.
There's serious information in there. Do you think you're bringing rap to a science audience or science to an established rap audience?
Well, I think there is a clear demographic shift. Basically, from my informal surveys, if you went through puberty before rap came out, you don't like it.
Okay.
And if you went through puberty after rap came out, you tend to think it's pretty cool. So, when people come to my show, if they're basically over 50, they don't expect to like the rap because they don't think they're the kind of person that likes rap. But if they're under 50, they probably think the science is going to be dry. And my favorite thing after the show is to have people come up to me and say, half the people will say, oh, I never thought of rap as an art form like that. Now I'm going to go give it another chance. And the other half of the people go, oh, wow, the science was really interesting.
I want to just lay out some key facts about Russia. We're talking about the largest country in the world, 17 million square kilometers, has a population of 142.5 million. Of that population, about 74% are living in cities. The average age in Russia, 42 years old, just about. And the GDP per capita, $18,000. That is US dollars measured in 2012 dollars. Compare that to Canada, which is about $42,000. Okay, Jeff. Country, largest in the world, population of 142.5 million, covering more than 1/9 of the Earth's surface. To what extent, we're trying to have this conversation about Russian identity, but to what extent can we have that conversation?
A single Russian identity. Well, the Russian identity, it's interesting. It's actually split in many ways. It's split between, as one of our other guests said, between people who, for the last 150 years, have considered Russia's mission really to join the West, right? Because Russia, for a whole host of reasons, was about a century behind in its economic and even political development behind the West. And a big part of the Russian public sphere wanted to join the West. Others said, no, really, Russia's special, it's different, its future really belongs to the countryside, to the Orthodox Church, to a kind of a hierarchical structure. And so Russians have been divided on this question for a very long time. Now, Russia's divided not only that way, but of course there's lots of different ethnic groups within Russia that are not even part of the great Russian identity, even within the word Russian itself, right? We just use one word, but of course in Russian there are two words, right? There's Rossiyski, meaning Russian citizen, and Ruski, meaning an ethnic Russian. And the Russians are divided on this.
Piotr, how do you see it, the identity of Russia? Is there any homogeneity to a Russian identity?
I don't think so. Russia is a typical multinational, multicultural society, but following Jeff, I would like to say that some would say that Russia, there are two Russias, one flying Russia in the private jets, and there is another Russia which is much poorer, much sober, and living their lives. The sociologists will tell you that there are three Russians, one modernized, and one archaic, and one in between. So there is no one Russian identity, I think so.
Konstantin, what about you? How would you describe a Russian identity?
I would like to say that there, in fact, is a Russian identity, although it's not really ethnic. I would identify as a Russian, although I have no I have no Russian blood. I would identify that as a Russian by language and by also certain social practices. And I think the Russian identity lies in a certain kind of collectivity. It lies in extended families, in personal connections with friends and neighbors, rather than mediated connections, individualism and consumption. These are not one or the other. It's just the Russian identity tends toward those forms of collectivity. And I think it's also, it also shares a sense of trauma, historical trauma, and a sense also of resistance to the difficult natural conditions, different political conditions. So trauma, resistance, pride in a kind of survivalist community, and certain forms of collectivity do fashion Russian national identity, although it is not ethnically Russian, it's highly mixed ethnically.
You know, Jeff made the point earlier about the split between Westernizers and Slavophiles. I mean, how important is that East-West identity difference in Russia, Konstantin?
I would say that we want to be careful defining the East. What the West is fairly clear. It's the society of individual consumption in a very formulaic and a very crude definition. But the East, in the Russian sense, it's about privileging forms of personal sociality over, say, individualist consumption. It doesn't say that the Russians do not participate in consumption and are not individualist, but they would rather privilege forms of communal being. So they would not watch TV at night, they would rather go and spend time with friends. They would not ship their grandparents to Florida for retirement, but rather take care of them at home. Well, there's no Florida in Russia, of course, but I think those examples would give you a sense of where Russians would go in terms of their Easternness. Those are the forms of sociality that define Easternness in Russia.
Okay, I'm going to go to Peter and then to Nina. Peter, go ahead. You want to say something?
Yes, not being a Russian, I am not sharing with Konstantin this romantic view of Russian as a collective person which is thinking about the past and family and friends. By all sociological data that we have, Russians are very individualistic. There is new personality which is dominating in Russia. This is not an individual citizen. This is an individual consumer, and this individual consumerism is the dominant feature in the Russian society. So I am not as romantic as Konstantin is, probably.
Okay, what about you, Nina? Are you as romantic as Konstantin is, or not as romantic as Piotr is?
No, I'm actually not romantic at all. And although I agree with Konstantin on certain issues, I think there is another thing important to consider when we talk about the Russian identity. A lot of Russian identity is defined by the idea. It is defined by the state. For Russians, throughout history, the state is more important than the individual being. And therefore, of course, there is consumerism and individualism, but state often takes all. So even if the Russians themselves do not want to feel this way, the great Russia is important to Russians, to many Russians, to most Russians, regardless of what ethnicity they represent. And I think that makes Russia a very difficult country to tackle and a very big problem for Russia to move forward, because in some ways the state somewhat changes, but society changes very little, because it is us versus them, the state versus something else. And by the way, Konstantin, we do have Florida now. We have Sochi. Yay.
I got to go to Jeff. Jeff wants to weigh in
here.
So
I think to reinforce what Nina just said, even when the Russians are not Slavophiles, that they feel that it is not that the fate of the country is to join the West, the method by which they shall join the West is not necessarily an individualistic, market-based notion, but it usually entails a very powerful role for the state. Right? And so the mission of the Russian state for Westernizers is to kind of drag the country kicking and screaming into the modern world.
That's the Agenda's Week in Review. And you can see all of those programs in their entirety several ways: on our website, theagenda.tvo.org, on our iTunes channel, and on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.